You're in a supermarket at the end of the day. Cart full, long line, everyone tired, just wanting to pay and leave. The bright lights, the constant noise, that feeling of urgency in the air. And then, suddenly, it begins. Your child starts to cry. It's not a soft cry. It's loud, intense, the kind that makes the whole room notice. In a few seconds, the people around you look. Some try to hide it, others don't even try. And without anyone saying anything, you feel the pressure, as if everyone is expecting the same thing from you. Make it stop. At that moment, it's not just the child crying, it's your body tensing, your heart racing, your mind trying to find a quick solution. And that inevitable thought appears. Everyone is judging me. So you react. You try to calm them down, distract them, negotiate, promise something, maybe speak more firmly than you'd like. Anything to end it as quickly as possible. Not because you want to, but because you need to. Now, imagine this same scene happening on a crowded train in Japan. The child cries with the same intensity. The environment is equally crowded, but something changes completely. The adult doesn't panic, doesn't try to control things immediately, doesn't react as if being judged. He is simply there, calm, present, observing, without shouting, without threatening, without trying to solve everything right away. And this seems strange, almost wrong, because it goes against everything we've learned. But according to Japanese teachings, on child rearing, that moment isn't a problem that needs to be immediately interrupted. It's a moment that's teaching something. And in this video, you'll understand exactly what they do differently, why it seems like they do less, but are actually teaching much more, and how to apply this to your reality, without feeling judged, without ignoring your child, and without resorting to yelling or punishment. And when all this is over, an awkward silence remains. Your child calms down, the atmosphere returns to normal, people go on with their lives, but you're left with that feeling in your head, that sense that something isn't right, that you've tried everything, calming, distracting, being firm, giving in, and yet nothing really seems to work for very long. And that's where the doubt comes in. Am I doing something wrong? This question comes up more often than parents like to admit, because it's not for lack of trying. On the contrary, most parents today are more informed, more concerned, and more present than ever before. But at the same time, they are also more confused. A study published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry showed that inconsistency in parental responses, alternating between control, distraction, and permissiveness, increases the child's difficulty in developing emotional self-regulation. In other words, it's not just what you do, it's the lack of clarity about how to act that undermines everything. And in the midst of all this, you try. You test one method, then another. You listen to different opinions, opposing advice, videos saying completely contradictory things. And in the end, you come back to the same place. Tired, doubting, silently wondering if you're really helping your child or just trying to put out fires every day. But here's the part that changes everything, and that most parents have never heard clearly. The problem isn't your son. I know this might sound strange at first, because during a tantrum, it seems exactly the opposite. It seems like disobedience. It seems like defiance. It seems like he's testing you all the time. But most of the time, that's not what's happening. What's happening is simpler and more profound. You were taught to react, not to understand. We've always been taught that when a child does something wrong, we need to correct it quickly, stop the behavior, control the situation, solve the problem right then and there. But this type of response focuses on what appears to be happening and ignores the root cause. Because behavior is not the root cause, it's a symptom. Behind a tantrum, there's usually something the child doesn't yet know how to do. It could be dealing with frustration,
waiting, expressing themselves, or even understanding what they're feeling. And when this isn't addressed, the cycle repeats itself. You correct the behavior, but it comes back again and again. Not because your child isn't learning, but that's because nobody taught them what's really missing.
And it's precisely here that many people begin to question all of this, because in practice, it doesn't seem so simple. You might be thinking, this doesn't work with every child. And to be honest, you're right. Every child is different, every context is different, and any approach that ignores this ends up frustrating more than helping. Other parents tried waiting and felt it didn't solve anything. The child continued crying, became more irritable, and the situation only worsened. So another question arises. Does waiting really help, or does it only make things worse? And there's an even stronger fear behind all of this. What if this traumatizes my child? Because nobody wants to make mistakes at that level. Nobody wants to look back and realize that in trying to do the right thing, they ended up causing pain. Many studies in developmental psychology, such as John Bowlby's work on attachment, show that emotional absence can profoundly impact a child. So the concern is valid. Furthermore, there is real life. You're tired, sometimes rushed, surrounded by people, dealing with 1,000 things at once. It's not a controlled laboratory. It's everyday life. And in this scenario, ideas that seem good in theory don't always work the way they're presented. And that's why simply copying a method, whether Japanese or any other, doesn't solve the problem. Because the problem was never just the child's behavior. It's about understanding what to do in the midst of chaos.
This is where the first principle, and perhaps the most important, inspired by Japanese teachings comes in: changing the way you interpret your child's behavior. Instead of viewing a tantrum as disobedience, you begin to see it as a lack of ability. This isn't just a nice idea. Researchers like Ross Greene, author of The Explosive Child, argue exactly that. Children do the best they can with the abilities they have. When they explode, it's not because they want to challenge you, but because they don't yet know how to handle that situation. And that completely changes your answer. Because if the problem is a lack of skill, punishment doesn't teach anything. It might stop the behavior for a moment, but it doesn't solve the root cause. It's like expecting someone to run if they've never learned to walk. So the question ceases to be, how do I make this stop? And it becomes, what's missing here? Perhaps it's a matter of patience. Perhaps it's about emotional control. Perhaps it's a matter of communication. And when you start looking at it from that angle, your posture changes. You move out of reaction mode and into teaching mode. The second principle is where many people get confused and end up making mistakes without realizing it. There is a huge difference between ignoring a child and observing with intention. Ignoring is absence. It's disconnecting, turning your back, leaving the child alone in the midst of something they don't yet know how to handle. And as studies on adult attachment show, this can further increase the child's emotional stress. But observing is completely different. It's about being there, present, attentive, available, without intervening immediately. In Japanese teachings, there's an idea called mimamoru, which means observing while protecting. In other words, you don't abandon the child, but you also don't take control of the moment. You create a safe space where the child can try to cope with what they're feeling. And in practice, this seems simple, but it requires a lot. Because it goes against the automatic impulse to solve everything quickly. Instead of immediately interrupting the crying, you allow a few seconds, sometimes a little longer, for the child to try to organize themselves internally. And you are there, reassuring them that they are not alone. It's not about letting them suffer. It's about providing space safely. And when the child begins, even slightly, to emerge from that state on their own, something important happens. They learn that they can do it. And this builds something that no immediate correction can teach: emotional autonomy. The third principle is what underpins all the others.
connection comes before control. Before teaching, correcting, or guiding, a child needs to feel safe. And this isn't just perception, it's biology. Studies in developmental neuroscience, such as the work of Alan Shore, show that a child's self-regulation capacity is formed from the relationship with the caregiver. In shaping brain functions such as the hypothalamus, limbic system, and prefrontal cortex.
In other words, they learn to calm themselves by being calmed. When a child senses that the bond doesn't depend on their behavior, something changes internally. They don't need to fight for attention or constantly test boundaries to feel secure. The nervous system becomes less reactive and more stable. And it is from this foundation that self-control begins to emerge. Therefore, in Japanese teachings, affection comes first. Closeness, care, and constant presence in the early years create a kind of security that later allows for greater independence. It's not about permissiveness. It's about building a strong enough emotional foundation so that the child can gradually regulate themselves. But it's important to make something clear. Japan is not perfect. No culture is perfect. There are real criticisms, social challenges, and even serious problems that cannot be ignored. So this isn't about idealizing a country or saying there's a perfect model for raising children. It's not about emotional abandonment either. Observing doesn't mean leaving the child alone, cold, and without support. When that happens, the effect is the opposite of what we're talking about here. And perhaps most importantly, this is not about copying a culture. Because what works in one context may not work exactly the same way in another. What you can take away from this are the principles, understanding what's behind it, and consciously adapting it to your own reality. In the end, real change doesn't begin with
the child. It starts with you. Because however difficult it may be to accept, your child's behavior is profoundly influenced by how you react in moments of tension. It's not about always being right, nor about being perfect. It's about consistency. Studies on co-regulation show that children learn to cope with emotions by observing and feeling the adult's response. If the adult becomes disorganized, the child becomes disorganized too. If the adult maintains some stability, even in chaos, that becomes a reference point. And this isn't built in a single moment. It is built on patterns. Small, repeated responses every day. The way you speak, how you react, how you handle frustration. That's what, little by little, teaches you much more than any single rule. Because in the end, your child doesn't learn only from what you say. He learns from you, who you are when things get out of control. So the next time your child loses control, perhaps the answer isn't to act faster, but to pause, even if it's just for a few seconds. Because in that space between impulse and reaction, something changes. You stop just reacting and start teaching. And what once seemed like just a tantrum begins to reveal itself as a learning moment, for him and for you. Perhaps it's not about making it stop. Perhaps it's about understanding. And when that change happens within you, everything around you starts to change too. If this video helped you see things differently, subscribe to the channel.
There's much more content like this to help you on this journey.